Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m., jolting Daniel from another nightmare about the cave-in. 5 years had passed since the accident, since he'd been the only one to crawl out of that collapsed mine shaft, leaving 3 of his crew buried beneath tons of rock and his own sanity fractured beyond repair. The therapist called it survivor's guilt. Daniel called it a life sentence. He almost didn't answer. The caller ID showed Ashley's name, but Ashley Martinez was supposed to be leading a geological survey deep in Yellowstone's backcountry. No cell towers, no contact for 2 weeks. That was the whole point of her research trip. Dan? Her voice was wrong. Hollow, like sound echoing through a long tunnel. Dan? Are you there? Ashley? Jesus, it's 3 in the morning. Where are you calling from? I'm in the cave, Dan. I'm in your cave. The words hit him like ice water. What cave? Ashley, you're in Wyoming. You're studying thermal features, not... I can hear them, Dan. I can hear your friends calling. They're still alive down here. They've been waiting for you. Daniel's hands began to shake. The phone felt impossibly heavy. Ashley, that's not possible. They died 5 years ago. I saw the cave-in. I felt the mountain come down. Marcus is here. He says you left him. Tommy's here too. They're angry, Dan. They're so angry that you didn't come back for them. Stop. The word came out as a whisper. Stop it. You don't know about that. Nobody knows about how you heard Marcus calling your name for 3 hours before the voices stopped? About how you could have gone back through the service tunnel but you were too scared? About how you told everyone the ceiling collapsed too fast to save anyone? Daniel dropped the phone. It clattered on his kitchen floor, but Ashley's voice continued, impossibly clear, impossibly present. He could hear it without the device, as if she were speaking directly into his skull. They want you to come home, Dan. They want you to finish what you started. He snatched up the phone with trembling fingers. You're not Ashley. Ashley doesn't know about the mine. I never told her. I never told anyone. Look outside, Dan. Against every instinct screaming at him to hang up, to turn off the phone, to run, Daniel walked to his kitchen window. In the pale moonlight, he could see Ashley standing in his backyard. She was wearing the same yellow hard hat from the geological survey photos she'd posted on Facebook. But her face was wrong. Too pale. Too still. Her eyes reflected the moon like an animal's. Come outside, Dan. Come down to us. The Ashley in his yard raised her hand and waved. Her mouth didn't move, but her voice continued inside his head, crawling through his thoughts like insects. We're all here. Marcus, Tommy, Dave. They forgive you, Dan. They just want you to join them. One last job. One last dig. Daniel backed away from the window, but he could still see her standing there, motionless, watching. The voice in his head grew stronger, more insistent. You know you belong with us. You've known it for 5 years. Every sleeping pill, every drink, every therapy session, you're just delaying the inevitable. You left us in the dark, Dan. Now it's your turn. He tried to focus on reality, on facts. Ashley was in Yellowstone. This wasn't real. PTSD could cause hallucinations. Stress could create false memories. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw coal dust under his fingernails. Dust that hadn't been there since the day of the accident. The voice laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Look closer, Dan. Look at what you really see. His reflection in the black window showed a man in a miner's helmet, coal-stained coveralls, and safety gear. Behind him, the kitchen had become a mine shaft, supported by rotting wooden beams that creaked ominously. Water dripped from somewhere in the darkness above. The cave never let you go, Dan. You've been down here with us all along. The surface world, the therapy, the normal life, that was the hallucination. This is real. This has always been real. Daniel spun around, but his apartment was still there. Normal walls, normal furniture, normal life. When he turned back to the window, Ashley was gone, but muddy footprints led from where she'd been standing directly to his back door. The handle turned without him touching it. "Time to come home," the voice whispered. No longer Ashley's voice, but something older, hungrier. "Time to stop running from what you did. Time to feed the dark." As the door swung open, Daniel saw not his backyard, but the entrance to a mine shaft. The same mine shaft. Marcus stood just inside the tunnel, his face exactly as it had been 5 years ago, except for his eyes. His eyes were holes filled with living shadow. "We've been waiting," Marcus said, his voice the echo of grinding stone. "We've been so patient, Dan. But now we're hungry. And we know exactly how you taste." The thing wearing Ashley's face stepped out from behind Marcus, but it was changing, melting, becoming something that had never been human. Its smile revealed teeth like broken stalactites. "The cave has been dreaming of you," it said. "Dreaming through us. Dreaming through everyone you've ever met. We are the hunger that lives in dark places. We are the guilt that eats minds. And you, Daniel Morrison, you opened the door when you left your friends to die." Daniel tried to slam the door, but his hands passed through it like mist. The mine shaft was expanding, consuming his kitchen, his life, his sanity. The entity that had worn Ashley's voice laughed with the sound of a mountain falling. "You can't close what was never really open. You can't escape what lives inside your own head. We are the thing that feeds on survivors, Dan. We are the reason you lived when others died. We kept you alive to feast on your guilt. And now you're perfectly seasoned." The last thing Daniel saw before the darkness swallowed everything was his own reflection in the black water that had suddenly flooded his apartment floor. His face was gone, replaced by the hungry, hollow void he'd been carrying inside himself for 5 years. In the silence that followed, something that had once been Daniel Morrison picked up a phone and began dialing another number. Another survivor. Another feast waiting to be harvested from the guilt that humans carried like seeds in their souls. The voice that answered was young, female, confused by the late hour. "Sarah? Sarah Chen? This is about the car accident. About your sister Emma. I know what really happened that night. I know what you did. I know." And in a cave that existed in the space between guilt and madness, something ancient and eternally hungry smiled with 1,000 borrowed faces, already tasting the next mind it would hollow out and wear like a mask. The mind never really collapsed. It just learned to hunt in places where the darkness was already there, waiting to be fed. Connor Williams adjusted his radio one final time before stepping onto the Whitewood Trail, his boots crunching against the frost-covered leaves. 23 years with the National Park Service had taught him that missing hikers usually turned up within the first 48 hours, embarrassed but alive. Rachel Griffin would be no different. The morning air bit at his weathered face as he surveyed the dense forest ahead. His supervisor had warned him about the unusual circumstances surrounding Rachel's disappearance. Her tent found perfectly intact, personal belongings untouched, no signs of struggle or wildlife interference. But Connor had seen it all before. City folks got disoriented, wandered off trail, panicked. Standard procedure would bring her home. He'd been the one to find her abandoned campsite 3 days earlier. Everything arranged with almost obsessive precision. Sleeping bag folded military style, food supplies organized by type, even her journal placed exactly parallel to her pillow. The only thing missing was Rachel herself, as if she'd simply evaporated from existence. Connor keyed his radio. "Base, this is Williams, beginning Sector 7 sweep. Should have the Griffin girl located by noon." His voice carried the confidence of 2 decades finding lost souls in these mountains. The static that answered him lasted longer than usual. "Williams, be advised. We've lost contact with the volunteer search teams in Sectors 4 and 6. Probably equipment failure, but maintain regular check-ins." A frown creased Connor's brow. Equipment didn't fail in multiple sectors simultaneously, but he'd dealt with stranger coincidences. He clipped the radio back to his belt and pushed deeper into the forest. The trail wound upward through towering pines that blocked most of the morning sun, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. Connor's experienced eyes swept the forest floor for any sign of Rachel's passage. Disturbed undergrowth, broken branches, footprints in the soft earth. Nothing. It was as if no human had ever walked this path. After 30 minutes of steady climbing, he found the first marker. A piece of bright blue fabric hung from a low branch exactly at eye level, fluttering in the still air. Connor recognized it immediately, the same shade as the jacket described in Rachel's missing person report. His pulse quickened slightly as he carefully extracted the fabric, noting how cleanly it had been torn. Too clean, almost deliberate. He resumed his search with renewed focus, following the faint deer trail that branched off from the main path. The forest seemed to grow denser around him, the silence so complete that his own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Even the typical forest sounds, bird calls, rustling wildlife, the distant chatter of squirrels, had ceased entirely. Connor paused, suddenly aware of how profoundly quiet everything had become. In 23 years, he'd never experienced such absolute silence in these woods. The hair on his forearms stood up beneath his uniform sleeves. The second marker appeared 20 yards ahead, another piece of blue fabric, this one larger, hanging from a branch that was definitely too high for someone of Rachel's height to reach without climbing. Connor stared up at it, his mind working through the logistics. Had she climbed the tree? Been pulled up somehow? The branch showed no signs of recent stress or damage. He reached for his radio. Base Williams here. Found evidence of the Griffin girl in Sector 7. Blue fabric markers appears to be from her jacket, continuing pursuit. The static lasted so long this time that Connor thought his radio had died. Then a voice emerged, distorted and barely recognizable. Williams, can you... Situation unclear. Multiple. The transmission cut to dead silence. Connor tapped the radio several times, then tried switching channels. Nothing but static on every frequency. A cold knot formed in his stomach, but he pushed the feeling aside. Equipment failed. It happened. He had a job to do. The deer trail became increasingly difficult to follow as the afternoon wore on. Branches seemed to reach across the path at face level, forcing Connor to duck and weave through obstacles that hadn't been there on his approach. The forest floor grew soft and spongy, his boots sinking slightly with each step into what felt like freshly disturbed earth. Connor stopped abruptly. The rational part of his mind tried to process what he was seeing, but the evidence before him defied explanation. His own footprints led away from where he currently stood, stretching back down the trail he'd just climbed. But that was impossible. He'd been walking in a straight line for the past hour. He knelt beside the clearest print and studied it carefully. Same boot pattern, same depth, same slight wear mark on the left heel where his gait favored his right side after an old injury. These were definitely his tracks, but they led in the opposite direction from where he'd come. Standing slowly, Connor felt the first real chill of unease creep up his spine. He pulled out his compass, waited for the needle to settle, then checked his GPS unit. Both instruments showed him traveling northwest exactly as planned, but his footprints clearly indicated he'd been moving southeast. The third piece of fabric hung directly in front of him now, close enough to touch without leaving the trail. This one was different, not torn, but cut with surgical precision into a perfect square. And beneath it, carved into the bark of the tree with what looked like fingernails, were 4 words. He took my eyes. Connor's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon, though he couldn't say why. The carving was fresh, sap still weeping from the gouged bark. But Rachel Griffin had been missing for 3 days, and this tree was a good 7 feet from the ground to where the message began. His radio crackled unexpectedly to life. Connor, a woman's voice, barely above a whisper. Connor's blood turned to ice. Nobody on the radio ever used his first name. Protocol demanded surnames and call signs. He lifted the radio with a trembling hand. This is Williams. Identify yourself. Connor, I can see you. The voice was closer now, as if the speaker had moved nearer to their microphone. Connor spun in a slow circle, scanning the forest around him, but saw nothing except endless trees and shadow. Who is this? Identify yourself immediately. Look up, Connor. Against every instinct screaming at him not to, Connor tilted his head back and looked into the canopy above. Rachel Griffin's face stared down at him from 30 feet up, her skin waxy pale, her mouth open in a soundless scream, but where her eyes should have been were only dark, weeping holes. Connor stumbled backward, his hand finding his weapon and drawing it in one fluid motion. But when he looked up again, the branches were empty. Only shadows and swaying pine needles remained. Connor, why didn't you find me sooner? The voice came from his radio again, but now it seemed to echo through the forest itself, surrounding him from every direction. Connor spun wildly, his weapon raised, but there was nothing to aim at except trees and darkness. I looked for you, he said aloud, his voice cracking slightly. I'm still looking for you. 3 days, Connor. 3 days I called for help while he took my eyes. The radio went silent, but the voice continued from somewhere in the trees around him. 3 days I screamed your name while he took my fingers. Connor saw them then, pale shapes hanging from the branches like obscene Christmas ornaments. Human fingers, suspended by what looked like fishing line, swaying gently in the still air. 10 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around where he stood. 3 days I begged for death while he took my teeth. The sound of rattling filled the air, dozens of human teeth falling like hail through the forest canopy, bouncing off Connor's shoulders and hat. He covered his head with his arms, but the teeth kept falling, piling up around his boots in small white drifts. Connor. The voice was right behind him now. He spun around, weapon raised, and found himself face to face with Rachel Griffin. But this wasn't the smiling college student from the missing person photos. This Rachel was something that had been broken and remade by violence and madness. Her empty eye sockets wept blood that had dried in black tracks down her cheeks. Her mouth was a ragged hole where teeth had been torn rather than extracted. Her fingers ended in bloody stumps that still dripped onto the forest floor. Why didn't you save me, Connor? Connor's training kicked in, muscle memory overriding the horror. He kept his weapon trained on the apparition while backing slowly away. You're not real, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Rachel Griffin is missing. You're not real. I was real when he found me, Connor. I was real when he tied me to the tree. I was real when he started cutting. The thing that wore Rachel's face tilted its head at an angle that broke physics, nearly turning completely upside down while its body remained upright. I was real when I screamed your name for 3 days. Where were you, Connor? Following protocol, Connor said, continuing to back away. Standard search procedures. We had teams looking. Liar. The word came out in a voice that wasn't Rachel's anymore. Deeper, layered with harmonics that made Connor's teeth ache. The forest around him began to shift and twist, trees bending into impossible shapes, the ground tilting at angles that should have sent him tumbling. You were drinking coffee in the ranger station, Connor, reading your newspaper, checking your email, while I bled out 30 yards from the main trail. Connor's back hit something solid, a tree that hadn't been there seconds before. The bark felt wrong against his uniform, soft and warm like human skin. When he glanced back, he saw it wasn't bark at all, but a surface covered in carved messages. Help me, Connor. He's cutting my fingers. Please, Connor, why won't you come? Connor, please. Hundreds of messages, maybe thousands, carved over each other in a desperate palimpsest of pain and abandonment. You found my campsite 3 days ago, Connor, but you didn't find me. Do you know why? Connor couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely, paralyzed by a terror so complete it bypassed all his training and experience. Because you stopped looking. You saw my tent, my belongings, and you decided I was probably fine. Probably just wandered off. Probably would turn up embarrassed and apologetic like all the others. The Rachel thing stepped closer, and Connor could smell the decay rolling off it in waves. Not just death, but something far worse. The scent of dreams rotting, of hope curdling into despair. But I wasn't fine, Connor. He had me. He had me for 3 days while you filled out paperwork. Connor tried to raise his weapon again, but his arms wouldn't respond. His entire body had gone numb, paralyzed by the magnitude of his guilt and failure. And now, Connor, he has you too. The forest exploded into chaos around him. Trees uprooted themselves and walked on root legs like spiders. The ground opened into chasms that breathed and whispered. The sky rained blood and fingernails and human hair. And through it all, Rachel's voice echoed from every direction at once, overlapping and harmonizing with itself in a choir of accusation and anguish. Look, Connor. Look what you let him do to me. Connor found himself in a clearing he didn't remember entering, standing before a massive pine tree whose trunk was wider than a house. Tied to that tree with barbed wire was Rachel Griffin, the real Rachel Griffin, exactly as she had been when the thing in the forest had found her. She was still alive. Her eyes tracked to Connor's face, and in them he saw 3 days of unimaginable torture, 3 days of calling his name, 3 days of waiting for rescue that had come too late. Her mouth tried to form words, but her tongue had been removed. Still, Connor could read her lips. Please help me. Connor tried to move toward her, but his legs betrayed him. He looked down to discover that his feet had sunk into the earth up to his ankles, as if the ground was slowly swallowing him alive. You're too late, Connor. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. You were always too late, but that's okay. He likes it when they struggle. He likes it when they call for help that never comes. Connor felt something sharp and cold trace across his neck, then his cheek, then the corner of his left eye. And Connor? He's been waiting for you to join us. The last thing Connor Williams saw before the blade took his eyes was Rachel Griffin, still tied to the tree, still alive after 3 days, still waiting for someone to save her, still waiting for him to do his job. The last thing he heard was his own voice echoing through the forest from his abandoned radio, calling for backup that would never come, reporting a situation that would never be believed, in a place that existed somewhere between the world of the living and the realm of the eternally, exquisitely damned. And in the darkness that followed, as the thing in the forest began its work, Connor finally understood that some searches never end. Some missing persons are never found, and some rescuers become victims themselves, trapped forever in the space between salvation and damnation, calling for help that will never arrive. The forest grew quiet again, patient and satisfied. It had plenty of time to wait for the next searcher to come looking for Connor Williams, and when they did, Rachel Griffin would be there to greet them, her empty sockets weeping welcome, her voice calling their name through the radio static. Please help me, she would whisper. I've been waiting for you. And the cycle would begin again. Logan Davis pulled his SUV into the gravel parking area, the engine's rumble dying into the oppressive silence of Blackwood National Forest. 3 days. Zoe Adams had been missing for 3 days, and the local search teams had found nothing, not a single trace, not even a footprint leading away from her abandoned campsite. He stepped out into the late afternoon air, his analytical mind already cataloging details. Temperature, approximately 68 degrees. Wind, minimal, from the southwest. Visibility, good, but diminishing as shadows lengthened between the towering pines. Logan had spent 15 years as a forensic investigator, and missing persons cases followed patterns. There were always patterns. The campsite sat exactly 1.3 miles northeast of the parking area, according to his GPS. Logan shouldered his pack, methodically checking his equipment. Digital camera, measuring tape, evidence bags, satellite phone, compass, and his notebook. The same leather-bound notebook that had helped him solve 47 cases over his career. Logic, observation, methodology. These things never failed. The trail wound upward through dense forest, marked by occasional yellow blazes on the massive tree trunks. Logan maintained a steady pace, occasionally stopping to photograph potential evidence. A broken branch here, disturbed undergrowth there. Nothing significant, but thoroughness was key. At exactly 4:47 p.m., he reached Zoe's campsite. The scene was wrong. Not wrong in any way he could immediately quantify, but wrong nonetheless. Zoe's bright red tent stood perfectly intact, guy lines taut, rain fly properly secured. Her backpack leaned against a nearby tree, contents apparently undisturbed. A circle of stones contained the remnants of a fire, cold ash gray and lifeless. Everything suggested a camper who had simply stepped away. Logan pulled out his camera and began documenting. Tent. No tears, no signs of struggle. Sleeping bag. Neatly arranged inside as if she'd planned to return. Food. Still hanging in a bear bag, 12 feet up a pine tree. He shot photos from multiple angles, his trained eye searching for the detail that would crack the case open. But as he worked, something nagged at him. The campsite was too perfect, too undisturbed. In 15 years of investigating outdoor disappearances, there were always signs: scattered gear, overturned cooking pots, at minimum some indication of hasty departure. Here, nothing. Logan consulted his watch. 5:23 p.m. Plenty of daylight remained. He began walking in expanding circles around the campsite, looking for tracks. The forest floor was a carpet of pine needles and decomposing leaves. Not ideal for preserving footprints, but there should have been something. Disturbed vegetation, broken twigs, pressed earth. 30 minutes later, he'd found nothing. Impossible. People didn't simply vanish without leaving traces. Logan returned to the campsite and opened his notebook, sketching the layout and noting measurements. As he worked, the silence pressed against his eardrums. Not natural silence. The complete absence of bird calls, insect noise, wind through the branches. In all his years working outdoor crime scenes, he'd never experienced such absolute quiet. A chill ran down his spine. Psychological response to an unusual environment, he told himself. The human nervous system was designed to detect threats, and extraordinary silence triggered ancient survival mechanisms. Perfectly normal reaction. He photographed Zoe's tent from the inside, documenting personal effects. Hiking boots, camp stove, romance novel bookmarked on page 127. Her journal lay open beside the sleeping bag, the final entry dated 3 days ago. Amazing sunset tonight. Planning to explore the North Ridge tomorrow. The forest here feels different somehow, older, like it's watching. Watching. Logan made a note of the phrase, though he dismissed its importance. People often projected consciousness onto natural environments, psychological phenomenon, nothing more. As he prepared to leave, Logan noticed something that made him pause. His GPS unit showed his position as 0.3 miles southwest of the campsite. But that was impossible. He was standing in the campsite. He checked the coordinates again, then walked 10 paces in each direction. The reading remained constant, 0.3 miles southwest. Equipment malfunction. Electronic devices could behave erratically in dense forest areas. Logan made a note to check the unit when he returned to the parking area. The hike back proved more difficult than expected. The trail seemed narrower somehow, forcing him to duck under branches that he didn't remember from the ascent. Twice he consulted his compass to confirm direction, and twice the needle pointed confidently south-southwest, exactly where it should. But the forest around him felt different, older, more watchful. Stop. Logan halted in the middle of the trail and took 3 deep breaths. He was allowing the atmospheric conditions and unusual silence to affect his judgment. Stress response could produce mild paranoid ideation, even in trained investigators. The solution was to focus on observable facts, not subjective impressions. He resumed walking, but after another 20 minutes, nothing looked familiar. The trail continued to wind downward through the pines, marked by the same yellow blazes. But Logan was certain he should have reached the parking area by now. His watch showed 7:15 p.m. He'd been walking for over an hour and a half. Logan stopped and pulled out his GPS. Position, 2.7 miles northeast of the parking area. But that was impossible. If he'd been walking steadily south-southwest for 90 minutes, he should be approaching the trailhead, not moving away from it, unless he'd somehow gotten turned around. People could become disoriented in dense forest, especially as daylight faded. Logan consulted his compass again, needle pointing steadily south-southwest. exactly where it had pointed for the entire descent. But according to the GPS, he was moving northeast. One of the instruments was malfunctioning. Had to be. Logan chose to trust the compass, a simple magnetic device with fewer opportunities for electronic error, and continued south-southwest. The trail descended through increasingly thick forest, twilight settling between the massive tree trunks like gray water. Another hour passed. Logan's watch showed 8:22 p.m., and according to his GPS, he was now 4.1 miles northeast of the parking area. Either the GPS was completely broken or what? Magnetic anomaly affecting his compass? Solar activity interfering with satellite signals? Logan forced himself to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation. He decided to make camp and reassess in the morning. Continuing to walk in darkness would only increase the risk of becoming further disoriented. Logan left the trail and found a relatively flat area beneath a cluster of pines. As he set up his emergency bivvy, he tried to make sense of the data. Fact: he'd walked south-southwest for over 3 hours. Fact: GPS showed him moving northeast. Fact: the trail markings appeared consistent. Fact: he was an experienced outdoorsman who had never become lost in 15 years of fieldwork. One of these facts was wrong. Logan settled into his sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but the absolute silence made rest impossible. No night sounds, no owls, no rustling small animals, no wind, just oppressive, tomb-like quiet that seemed to press against his thoughts. At some point he must have dozed, because he jerked awake to find pale morning light filtering through the branches above. His watch showed 6:47 a.m. Logan packed quickly and returned to the trail, eager to solve the navigation mystery in daylight. The trail continued downward, marked by the same yellow blazes. But after 30 minutes of walking, Logan realized something that made his blood run cold. He was passing landmarks he recognized from the previous evening. The same distinctive boulder, the same lightning-struck pine, the same fallen log across a small creek. He was walking in a circle. No, impossible. The trail descended consistently. He'd been walking downhill for hours yesterday and again this morning. Trails didn't form perfect circles in mountainous terrain. There had to be multiple trails, similar terrain features, some logical explanation. Logan consulted his GPS 4.8 miles northeast of the parking area, but the compass still pointed south-southwest, and the trailblazes continued to lead in that direction. He photographed the GPS display, the compass, and the trail markers, building evidence for what was becoming an impossible situation. Logic demanded that he trust his instruments over his subjective impressions. But which instruments? The GPS that showed him moving in the wrong direction, or the compass that pointed toward a trail that seemed to loop back on itself? Logan forced himself to sit down and think. In 15 years of solving complex cases, he'd learned that when evidence seemed contradictory, the solution was always to gather more data. He would mark his position, walk for exactly 1 hour, then return to this spot. If he was actually walking in circles, he should arrive back here. If not, he would be somewhere else entirely. He arranged 3 stones in a distinctive triangle next to the trail and noted the time, 8:15 a.m. Then he resumed walking south-southwest, following the yellow blazes deeper into the forest. The trail descended through pine groves that felt increasingly ancient. The trees grew larger, their massive trunks disappearing into the canopy high above. Logan had worked in many forests, but this felt different, primordial, as if the forest predated human presence by millennia. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Logan rounded a bend and stopped dead. Ahead of him, next to the trail, sat 3 stones arranged in a distinctive triangle, the same triangle he'd made an hour ago. Logan stared at the stones, his analytical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He pulled out his GPS, 4.8 miles northeast of the parking area. Exactly the same reading as an hour ago. But he'd been walking steadily for 60 minutes. He should be somewhere else, anywhere else. He photographed the stone triangle, his hands shaking slightly. Stress response, he told himself. Even the most rational person could experience physiological reactions to unusual circumstances. But unusual wasn't the right word. This was impossible. Logan sat heavily on a fallen log and opened his notebook. For 15 years, he'd solved cases by documenting facts and following logical conclusions. He would approach this the same way. Hypothesis 1: equipment malfunction. Both GPS and compass were providing incorrect readings. Hypothesis 2: disorientation. He was somehow misreading the trail markers or following the wrong trail. Hypothesis 3: external interference. Some natural phenomenon was affecting his navigation instruments and perception. Hypothesis 4. Logan paused, his pen hovering over the page. There was no hypothesis 4 that his rational mind could accept. The evidence suggested that he was walking in a perfect circle along a trail that consistently descended. Such a thing was geometrically impossible, unless the forest itself was changing around him. Logan slammed the notebook shut. He was a forensic investigator, not a fantasist. There had to be a rational explanation. He just hadn't found it yet. But as he sat in the oppressive silence, surrounded by ancient pines that seemed to lean inward like eavesdroppers, Logan felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years of methodical casework, the cold touch of genuine fear, because in the corner of his vision, just at the edge of perception, he could swear the yellow blaze on the nearest tree had moved 3 inches to the left. Landon had seen it all in his 15 years with the National Park Service. Missing hikers, bear attacks, flash floods that swept away entire camping groups. He'd pulled bodies from ravines, tracked survivors through blizzards, and talked panicked tourists down from cliff edges. Nothing rattled him anymore. Nothing surprised him. That confidence felt solid as granite as he adjusted his radio and started down the main trail into Blackwood National Forest. Madison Chen, 23, experienced hiker, had missed her check-in call yesterday evening. Routine search and rescue. He'd probably find her with a twisted ankle at most, maybe embarrassed about getting turned around on trails she'd hiked a dozen times before. The morning air carried the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. Landon's boots found their rhythm on the well-worn path, muscle memory guiding him past landmarks he could navigate blindfolded. Left at the split oak, right where the creek bends, straight through the meadow clearing. 15 minutes in, he found Madison's first trail marker. Her bright yellow bandana hung from a branch exactly where protocol demanded, marking her intended route toward Eagle Point. Landon nodded approvingly. Madison knew what she was doing. The bandana looked fresh, no weather damage. She'd been here yesterday just as planned. He keyed his radio. Base, this is Ranger Patterson. Found first marker, proceeding along Madison's planned route. Copy that, Landon. Weather's supposed to hold steady. Should be a quick one. Should be. The words echoed in Landon's mind as he continued deeper into the forest. The trail here was narrow but clear, worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. He'd walked this exact path hundreds of times, could probably do it blindfolded. 20 minutes later, he stopped. The trail split in front of him, 2 paths diverging at sharp angles, both looking equally well-traveled. Landon stared at the fork, his certainty wavering for the first time all morning. This wasn't right. The main trail to Eagle Point didn't split here. There was no fork for another half-mile at least. He'd hiked this route last month. Hell, he'd hiked it last week. He knew every route, every rock, every bend. Landon pulled out his map and GPS unit. According to both, he should be standing on a straight section of trail with no branches for another 1,000 yards. But the fork stretched before him, undeniable and impossible. He chose the left path, reasoning that Madison would have done the same. The trail felt different here, older somehow. The trees pressed closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block most of the morning light. Strange shadows moved between the trunks, probably just wind, but they seemed to follow him. 10 minutes along the left fork, Landon found Madison's second marker. Her red bandana hung from a low branch, exactly where it should be according to her filed route plan. But according to his map and GPS, this spot was supposed to be empty forest. nowhere near the established trail. The radio crackled with static when he tried to call base. He adjusted the frequency, checked the battery, tried again. More static. Equipment failure was rare but not impossible. He'd continue the search and report back when he reached higher ground. The path ahead curved sharply right, following what his instruments insisted was a creek that didn't exist. Landon could hear water running, could smell the damp mineral scent of moving water. But his topographical map showed solid ground for miles in every direction. He kept walking. Madison's third marker should have been at the creek crossing. Instead, Landon found it hanging from a tree that stood in the middle of what his map labeled as Owl Lake. But there was no lake here, no water at all. Just forest floor covered in decades of fallen leaves, and Madison's blue bandana fluttering in the windless air. Landon's hand shook as he rechecked his GPS coordinates. The device insisted he was standing in 8 feet of water. The backup compass pointed steadily north, but north led deeper into the trees instead of toward the ranger station where it belonged. Time felt wrong too. His watch read 9:30 a.m., but the light filtering through the canopy looked like late afternoon, golden and slanted and heavy with the weight of approaching evening. The fourth marker hung from a branch at eye level, close enough to touch. Madison's green bandana, bright against the dark bark. But Landon hadn't seen this tree a moment ago. He would have remembered it. The trunk was massive, bigger around than his truck, with bark carved deep with symbols that looked almost like letters. Almost like words. Like a message. Landon reached for the bandana and stopped. His hand cast 3 shadows on the tree trunk. 3 distinct shadows from 3 different light sources, though only one weak sun shone through the canopy above. Something moved in his peripheral vision. When he turned, the forest looked different. The trees had rearranged themselves, forming a corridor that led toward a clearing he'd never seen before. In the center of the clearing, a figure in hiking gear sat motionless on a fallen log. "Madison?" His voice echoed strangely, coming back to him changed, deeper, speaking words he hadn't said. The figure didn't respond, didn't move at all. Landon approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the emergency whistle on his belt. 20 feet away, he could see long dark hair beneath a bright green cap. Madison's hair, Madison's cap. "Madison, are you all right?" Still no response. As he got closer, Landon realized why. Madison was facing away from him, but also toward him. Her head pointed in both directions simultaneously, an impossible angle that made his vision blur and his stomach lurch. Her hiking boots touched the ground while her body floated 3 feet above the log she sat on. When he blinked, she was normal again, sitting normally, facing away from him like any tired hiker taking a rest. "Madison?" She turned around. Her face was exactly as it should be, exactly as it appeared in the photo her friends had provided. Young and vibrant and concerned. But her mouth moved without making sound, and when she spoke, the words came from behind him. "I've been waiting for you, Landon." He spun around. The clearing was empty except for trees that hadn't been there moments ago. When he turned back, Madison was gone. The log was gone. The clearing itself was gone, replaced by dense forest that his rational mind insisted had always been there. But he could still hear her voice, coming from every direction and no direction at all. "The trail goes deeper, Landon, much deeper. Come find me." Landon's radio squawked with static. Through the interference, he heard his own voice calling base, reporting that he'd found Madison safe and sound, that they were both heading back to the station. But he was standing alone in the forest, and he hadn't touched his radio. The voice on the radio continued his report in perfect detail, describing a successful rescue that hadn't happened. Base acknowledged, marked the case closed, told him to bring Madison in for a medical check. Landon stared at the radio in his hand. The transmission light wasn't even on. A new path opened in front of him, leading deeper into the forest. Trees shifted aside like curtains, revealing a trail that pulsed with its own sickly light. Madison's voice drifted from somewhere ahead, singing a song he'd never heard but somehow knew all the words to. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back to return to the ranger station to get backup and equipment and support, but the path behind him was gone now, replaced by solid rock wall that stretched up into darkness. Forward was the only option left. Landon's 15 years of experience meant nothing here. His training, his knowledge, his careful preparations, all useless against a forest that rewrote its own rules with every step. The confident veteran who'd started this search was fracturing, piece by piece, with each impossible thing he witnessed. But Madison was out there somewhere, real or not, alive or something else. She was waiting for him. He started down the glowing path, leaving his sanity behind. The forest welcomed him with a sound like laughter, and began to change once again. If this story caused genuine chills, follow for more terror crafted to haunt. Could you trust your own senses in Landon's place? Derek's GPS unit flickered once before displaying the coordinates with mechanical precision. 47.802221 degree N, 123.600404 degree W. 3 days since Madison Chen had vanished from the Ho River Trail, and the Olympic National Park's search and rescue coordinator had requested his expertise in pattern analysis. 22 successful recoveries in the past 4 years had earned Derek a reputation for finding people when others had given up. Logic, methodology, and statistical probability had never failed him. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks forming a cathedral of shadows that seemed to swallow sound itself. Derek consulted his tablet, cross-referencing Madison's last known position with topographical data, weather patterns, and historical search outcomes. The math was straightforward. Given her experience level, available daylight, and typical disorientation patterns, she should be within a 2-mile radius of her last confirmed location. His radio crackled with static as he documented the first grid section. Base, this is Derek. Beginning systematic sweep of Sector 7. No immediate visual indicators. Copy that, Derek. Park rangers reported some unusual wildlife behavior in that area yesterday. Bears moving out of territory early. Might want to factor that into your analysis. Derek frowned at his tablet screen. Wildlife displacement wasn't uncommon, but the timing seemed arbitrary. He opened his wildlife behavior database, cross-referencing recent bear movement patterns with missing person cases. No statistical correlation emerged, just another variable to catalog and dismiss. The trail markers became increasingly sparse as he moved deeper into the designated search area. His methodical approach had always been his greatest asset. Document everything, trust the data, follow logical progressions. Every snapped branch, every disturbed section of earth, every piece of fabric caught on vegetation became a data point in his expanding matrix of probability. But something felt fundamentally wrong about this forest. Derek stopped at what his GPS indicated was Madison's last confirmed position, marked by a small pile of stones the initial search team had left. He photographed the location from multiple angles, noting the unusual absence of typical camping debris or struggle indicators. Madison's backpack had been found here, contents undisturbed, no signs of wildlife interference or human conflict. That was the first anomaly that didn't fit his models. He expanded his search pattern in calculated spirals, measuring each step, photographing every potential clue. 43 minutes into the methodical sweep, Derek discovered something that made him stop entirely. A depression in the soft earth, roughly human-sized, surrounded by a perfect circle of dead vegetation. The grass and small plants had withered in a precise geometric pattern, as if something had drained the life from the very soil. Derek knelt beside the formation, his scientific training warring with an uncomfortable crawling sensation along his spine. He took soil samples, photographed the anomaly from every angle, measured the exact diameter of the dead zone. 12 feet, 4 inches. The precision bothered him more than the phenomenon itself. His radio remained silent when he tried to contact base. Static filled the frequency, punctuated by sounds that almost resembled whispers in a language he couldn't identify. The forest had become unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, no wind moving through the canopy above. Derek checked his noise meter. The ambient sound level had dropped to near absolute silence, a statistical impossibility in a living ecosystem. He found the second dead circle 30 yards northeast of the first, then a third, then a fourth, each one identical in size and formation, creating a pattern that his analytical mind recognized as deliberately constructed. Someone, or something, had created a geometric design spanning nearly an acre of forest floor. Derek's hands trembled slightly as he plotted the coordinates on his tablet. The dead zones formed a perfect pentagram. At the center of the formation, where the lines intersected, Derek found Madison's hiking boots. They sat neatly side by side, laces tied, as if she had simply stepped out of them and vanished. No footprints led away from the boots, no disturbance in the surrounding earth, no logical explanation for their placement. His tablet screen flickered and died, despite showing full battery life moments before. The GPS unit followed, its display fading to black with a soft electronic whine. Derek's training had prepared him for equipment failure, but not for the systematic death of every electronic device he carried. The silence deepened around him, becoming so absolute that Derek could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the trees. He picked up Madison's boots, noting their weight, their condition, the wear patterns that suggested she had been walking normally until the moment she disappeared. No signs of struggle, no indication of force or coercion. She had simply ceased to exist. Derek began walking back toward what he hoped was the main trail, but the forest had changed. Trees he had carefully marked and photographed were no longer where his mental map indicated they should be. The terrain itself seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it, paths appearing and disappearing like optical illusions. His compass spun wildly before settling on magnetic readings that changed every few seconds. North became south, became west, became nowhere at all. The logical frameworks that had governed Derek's entire professional life crumbled with each impossible step through a forest that obeyed no natural laws. Something massive moved between the trees ahead of him, too large and too fluid to be any known wildlife. Derek glimpsed sections of bark-like skin, movements that suggested a creature tall enough to blend with the ancient trunks around it. When he focused his attention on any specific area, nothing was there. When he looked away, peripheral vision caught shapes that violated everything he understood about biology and physics. The thing was watching him. Derek found himself in a clearing he had never seen before, surrounded by trees whose trunks bore symbols carved deep into their bark. The markings resembled no known language or indigenous artwork, consisting of geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when observed directly. Some of the carvings were fresh, still weeping sap. Others appeared ancient, weathered by decades or centuries of exposure. At the center of the clearing stood a structure that Derek's rational mind refused to process correctly. It appeared to be constructed from interwoven branches and bones, rising 15 feet into the canopy above. Human remains were visible among the organic architecture, skulls, rib cages, intact skeletons still wearing the remnants of modern clothing. Derek recognized a park ranger's uniform among the bones, a hiker's bright orange jacket, a child's small sneakers still tied to tiny skeletal feet. Madison's red flannel shirt hung from the structure's apex like a banner. The thing emerged from the trees with deliberate slowness, revealing itself in segments that Derek's brain struggled to assemble into a coherent image. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, its flesh a living amalgamation of bark, moss, and earth that shifted and flowed like liquid while maintaining an essentially humanoid shape. Where its face should have been, Derek saw only a hollow cavity filled with moving shadows and the sound of wind through empty spaces. It spoke without vocal cords, its voice emerging from the forest itself, from the rustle of leaves, the creaking of branches, the whisper of wind through the clearing. The words formed inside Derek's skull rather than entering through his ears. "You seek the lost one." Derek's training had never prepared him for this moment. Every protocol, every procedure, every logical framework he had built his career upon became meaningless in the presence of something that should not exist. He tried to speak, to maintain some semblance of professional composure, but only managed a strangled whisper. "Where is Madison?" The Guardian gestured toward the bone structure with an arm that extended and contracted like a living branch. "She feeds the old growth now. as do all who trespass in the sacred places. As will you. Derek understood with terrible clarity that he was looking at decades of missing persons cases. Hikers, campers, researchers, park personnel, all the unexplained disappearances that had been attributed to wilderness accidents or human predators. They had all encountered this guardian. They had all become part of its territory. The entity moved closer, and Derek felt the life force draining from his body with each step it took. The grass beneath his feet withered and died. His skin became cold and dry. His thoughts slowed and became sluggish, as if his very consciousness was being absorbed by something infinitely older and more powerful than human civilization. Your kind builds its small villages on our ancient grounds, the Guardian continued, its voice now coming from multiple directions simultaneously. You map and measure and claim dominion over forces you cannot comprehend. But the forest remembers. The forest reclaims. Derek's vision blurred as the life drained from his cells. He tried to run, but his legs no longer responded to conscious control. The rational part of his mind, the part that had always trusted in observable phenomena and logical conclusions, finally accepted the truth that his instruments and methodologies were utterly powerless against forces that predated human understanding by millennia. The last thing Derek saw before consciousness faded was his own reflection in Madison's eyes, still bright and aware, trapped forever in the hollow spaces of the Guardian's impossible anatomy. She mouthed a single word that he understood with devastating clarity: join. Searchers found Derek's equipment scattered across a 12-foot circle of dead vegetation 3 days later. His radio, tablet, and GPS devices had been arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, their circuits fused beyond repair by heat that left no other traces. The search team's report noted unusual electromagnetic interference in the area and recommended avoiding the sector during future operations. Derek's final status was officially recorded as missing, presumed dead, due to wilderness exposure. The Guardian watches from between the trees, patient and eternal, waiting for the next rational mind to venture too deep into territories where human logic holds no dominion. The forest keeps its secrets and feeds its ancient hungers, and grows stronger with each soul that learns too late that some things cannot be mapped, measured, or understood, only survived, or not. Daniel adjusted his GPS coordinates for the third time, cross-referencing them with the topographical map spread across his dashboard. Sarah's last known location placed her approximately 4.2 miles northeast of the Cascade Ridge trailhead, and his methodical approach had never failed him in 12 years of search and rescue operations. The afternoon sun filtered through the windshield as he organized his equipment with practiced precision. Compass, altimeter, emergency beacon, first aid kit. Everything had its place, every variable accounted for. The forest ranger had seemed oddly reluctant to provide the coordinates, mentioning something about unusual reports from that sector, but Daniel dismissed such unscientific concerns. Sarah was a seasoned researcher. She wouldn't venture into dangerous terrain without proper preparation. Most likely, she'd discovered something significant enough to extend her botanical survey beyond the planned time frame. People got absorbed in their work. It happened. He locked his vehicle and consulted his watch, 2:47 p.m. Allowing for search time and return hike, he'd have adequate daylight. The trail began normally enough, well-maintained and clearly marked, winding through familiar Douglas fir and western hemlock. His boots found steady rhythm on the packed earth as he calculated distance and elevation gain. After 43 minutes of hiking, he should reach the vicinity of Sarah's last GPS ping. The forest felt denser than his previous visits to this area, but seasonal growth could explain that. Trees seemed taller, their canopy thicker, filtering the sunlight into an increasingly muted amber glow. He checked his altimeter. The reading showed 3,847 feet, which aligned with his calculations. Everything remained within expected parameters. At the 45-minute mark, Daniel paused to reassess. According to his GPS, he should be approaching Sarah's last known position, but the terrain didn't match his topographical map. The trail had been gradually curving left for several hundred yards, yet his map indicated it should bend right. He backtracked 50 yards and checked again. The trail definitely curved left. Map error. It happened, though rarely with this particular publisher. He continued forward, trusting his GPS over printed materials, but made careful mental notes of the discrepancies for later reporting. The wrongness began as a subtle sensation in his peripheral vision. Trees that seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. Shadows that fell at angles inconsistent with the sun's position. Daniel stopped frequently to verify his instruments, but they provided consistent readings. Elevation, 4th, 203 feet. Direction, northeast. Distance traveled, 3.1 miles. Yet something felt fundamentally incorrect about the space around him. He discovered Sarah's first piece of equipment at what his GPS claimed was her exact coordinates. A field notebook wedged between two rocks, its pages filled with increasingly frantic handwriting. The early entries documented normal botanical observations, but the later passages grew disturbing. Distance measurements inconsistent. Trail doesn't match survey maps. Time seems to move differently here. The final entry, written in shaking script, simply read, "The forest is watching. It knows I know." Daniel examined the notebook with analytical detachment. Sarah had clearly been experiencing some form of psychological distress, possibly altitude-related disorientation or dehydration-induced confusion. The human brain could create elaborate delusions under stress. He photographed each page methodically and continued his search pattern. The trail forked ahead, or rather it split into 3 distinct paths, where his map showed only one. Daniel stood at the junction for several minutes, consulting his instruments repeatedly. His GPS indicated he was still on the correct trail, but physically he faced an impossible choice. He selected the middle path, marking his decision with a bright orange flag. Within 20 minutes, the middle path had somehow become the leftmost path, with 2 new trails branching off to his right. He hadn't changed direction or deviated from his course, yet the configuration had shifted around him. Daniel stopped walking and forced himself to think scientifically. Disorientation could cause false memories. Fatigue could distort perception. He checked his watch, 6:23 p.m. That was impossible. His watch had read 2:47 p.m. when he'd started hiking less than 2 hours ago. Even accounting for the longest possible search scenario, it couldn't be past 5:30 p.m. He examined the watch face closely, tapped the crystal, held it to his ear. The mechanism sounded normal. The second hand moved in steady intervals, yet the displayed time suggested he'd been hiking for nearly 4 hours. The sun's position confirmed the late hour. Long shadows stretched between the trees, and the light had taken on the golden quality of approaching evening. But this violated everything he understood about temporal measurement and physical space. He'd covered perhaps 4 miles of relatively easy terrain. The mathematics didn't work. Sarah's backpack hung from a branch 8 feet above the ground, its straps arranged in a neat bow as if someone had carefully placed it there. The branch showed no signs of damage, no scratches or broken bark that would indicate climbing. Daniel circled the tree 3 times, examining the trunk for any possible means of ascent, but the smooth bark offered no handholds until well above the backpack's position. Inside the pack, he found Sarah's logbook, water bottles, and emergency supplies. Everything except her radio and GPS unit. The final log entry was dated 3 days ago, but according to her research schedule, she'd only been missing for 36 hours. The entry read, "Day 7 in the shifting zone. Trails rearrange themselves when I'm not watching. Time moves in circles. I think I've been walking the same mile of forest for 6 days, but my instruments insist I'm covering new ground. The trees remember everything. They're trying to tell me something, but I don't speak their language. I don't think I'm going to find my way out." Day 7. But Sarah had been missing for a day and a half. Daniel checked his own GPS coordinates and cross-referenced them with his starting position. According to the device, he'd traveled 6.2 miles northeast of the trailhead, yet when he looked back the way he'd come, he could see his orange trail marker hanging from a branch not 40 yards away. The flag he'd placed at the 3-way fork that should have been over a mile behind him. He walked back to the marker to confirm his observation. The flag was exactly where he'd left it, tied to the same branch, but now it marked a simple straight trail with no forks or branches. The three paths he'd seen earlier no longer existed. The trail continued in both directions as a single, clear route through the forest. His hands shook as he checked his altimeter. The reading showed 2,156 feet, nearly 2,000 feet lower than his previous measurement, despite having walked continuously uphill for the past hour. The instrument had functioned perfectly for 8 years without a single malfunction. The forest around him had changed again. The trees were different species, mountain ash and lodgepole pine instead of the Douglas fir he'd been walking through. Yet he'd never deviated from the trail, never turned or branched off his chosen path. The very composition of the ecosystem had shifted around him like a stage set being rearranged between acts. Daniel forced himself to apply scientific methodology to an increasingly unscientific situation. He began documenting everything: coordinates, timestamps, detailed descriptions of his surroundings, creating an evidence trail that might later help explain what was happening to him. But even as he wrote, the words seemed to rearrange themselves on the page, forming sentences he hadn't intended to write. "You're not finding Sarah. You're becoming Sarah. The forest doesn't lose people, it absorbs them." He hadn't written those words. His hand had moved across the page independently, guided by some external force that bypassed his conscious control. Daniel stared at the notebook, watching his own handwriting form letters and words without his volition. "We tried to leave. We all tried to leave. But the forest grows larger as you move through it and smaller as you try to escape. Eventually you realize you're not lost. You're home." The pen fell from his trembling fingers. Around him, the trees had begun to whisper in voices he almost recognized, Sarah's voice among them, calling his name from directions that changed each time he turned his head. The whispers echoed from above, below, and somehow from inside his own mind, creating a layered harmony of human speech transformed into something utterly inhuman. Daniel ran. His analytical mind screamed that running was illogical, that he needed to remain calm and think through the situation, but his deeper brain had assumed control, flooding his system with adrenaline and overriding rational thought. He crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs, his equipment scattering behind him as he fled from an enemy he couldn't identify or understand. The forest ran with him. Trees slid past his peripheral vision like flowing water, their positions shifting to accommodate his panicked flight. The trail beneath his feet extended infinitely ahead, while simultaneously contracting behind him, as if the very ground were a treadmill designed to keep him moving without ever allowing him to arrive anywhere. His GPS showed his position changing, coordinates scrolling past at impossible speeds, while the landscape around him remained essentially unchanged. He stumbled into a clearing he'd never seen before, gasping for breath, and found himself face to face with his own vehicle. The parking area, the trailhead marker, his locked car sitting exactly where he'd left it hours earlier. According to his watch, it was now 2:51 p.m. He'd gained time by running deeper into the forest. Daniel approached his car slowly, suspicious of this impossible return. The vehicle was real. He could feel the metal, cold and solid under his touch. He could see his trail map still spread across the dashboard, his thermos of coffee still warm in the cup holder. But when he looked back toward the forest, the trail he'd just emerged from had vanished. Dense undergrowth filled the space where the path had been, as if it had never existed. He circled the parking area 3 times, searching for any sign of the trail. According to his map, the Cascade Ridge trailhead began just 20 yards from where he stood, but the forest presented an unbroken wall of vegetation. No path, no markers, no indication that humans had ever passed this way. The ranger station was only 4 miles down the access road. He could drive there, report the situation, request assistance. Professional search teams with proper equipment could locate Sarah and extract her from whatever geographical anomaly had trapped her in that impossible space. Daniel started his engine and pulled onto the narrow mountain road, already formulating his report. The road curved left where it should curve right. It descended into valleys that didn't exist on his topographical surveys. Mile markers counted backward, and his odometer registered negative distance. After driving for 45 minutes, he passed a familiar landmark, a distinctive rock formation he'd noticed on his way in, and realized he was heading deeper into the mountains instead of toward civilization. He stopped the car and checked his compass. The needle spun slowly in complete circles, unable to find magnetic north. His GPS showed his position as a blank area on the map, coordinates that corresponded to empty space between documented features. According to the device, he was nowhere. Sarah's voice came through his radio, crackling with static. "Daniel, can you hear me? I found something. I found why people disappear here. The forest isn't just geography. It's alive, and it's hungry, and it feeds on the certainty that people carry about reality. The more sure you are about how things work, the more it wants to prove you wrong. I've been walking the same mile of trail for weeks, but time doesn't work the same way here. I keep trying to radio for help, but I think my calls are reaching different times, different places. If you can hear this, don't try to find me. The forest likes people who think they can solve its puzzles. It keeps them." Daniel keyed his radio. "Sarah, this is Daniel. What's your position? I'm coming to get you." "Daniel?" Her voice carried a note of desperate hope. "How long have I been missing? In your time, I mean. How long?" 36 hours. Since Tuesday morning." Static filled the channel for several seconds before Sarah responded. "I've been here for months, Daniel. Maybe years. The forest, it doesn't let time move forward anymore. I think I'm becoming part of it. I can feel my thoughts spreading into the trees, my memories becoming their memories. Don't look for me. Don't try to understand what's happening. Just drive away and don't come back." The radio went silent. Daniel tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but received only empty static in response. Around him, the forest pressed closer to the road, branches reaching toward his vehicle like grasping fingers. In his rearview mirror, he could see the road behind him had vanished, replaced by solid forest that extended as far as his vision could reach. He was no longer on a road. His car sat in the middle of a vast woodland clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. The asphalt beneath his tires had become dirt and fallen leaves. His engine was still running. His headlights still illuminated the darkness that had somehow fallen while he wasn't paying attention, but he was no longer in any place that existed on any map. Daniel opened his door and stepped out into the impossible night. Above him, stars arranged themselves in patterns he'd never seen before, constellations that shifted and rearranged themselves as he watched. The moon hung in 3 different phases simultaneously, waxing crescent, full, and waning gibbous, casting overlapping shadows that moved independently of any celestial mechanics he understood. In the distance, he could see lights moving between the trees. Not flashlights or electric illumination, but something organic and phosphorescent like foxfire or bioluminescent fungi. The lights pulsed in complex patterns, and as they drew closer, Daniel realized they were words, sentences of light spelling themselves across the darkness in languages he'd never learned, but somehow understood. "Welcome to the place where certainty comes to die," the lights wrote against the night sky. "You've spent your life believing in measurements, in fixed points and reliable data. Here those beliefs become food for something vast and patient and endlessly hungry. Sarah understands now. Soon you will too." Daniel's watch had stopped at 2:47 p.m., the exact moment he'd entered the forest. His GPS showed coordinates that changed every time he looked at the screen, displaying impossible locations, latitude and longitude that placed him in multiple countries simultaneously. His compass needle pointed steadily toward a magnetic north that seemed to be located directly above his head. He understood, with the awful clarity of complete helplessness, that he would never leave this place, not because he was lost, but because the place itself had claimed him. He was no longer a person moving through geography. He was geography, part of a landscape that existed outside the normal rules of space and time. Sarah emerged from between the trees, but she was no longer entirely Sarah. Her form flickered like a projection, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, as if she existed only partially in this reality. When she spoke, her voice came from the forest itself, echoing from every tree and stone and blade of grass. "I tried to warn you," she said, "but the forest wanted you to come. It needs people like us, people who believe they can analyze and understand everything. Our certainty feeds it, makes it stronger. Each time we try to apply logic to this place, it grows a little larger, a little more complex. We're not victims, Daniel. We're collaborators in our own absorption." Daniel felt his notebook in his pocket, the pages now filled with observations he'd never written, calculations that led to impossible conclusions, measurements of distances that changed depending on who was doing the measuring. His mind, trained to categorize and analyze, began cataloging the impossibilities around him, and with each new observation, he felt himself becoming less solid, less individual. The forest was patient. It would give him time to understand, time to document every paradox and impossibility until his need to analyze became indistinguishable from his need to exist. Eventually, like Sarah, he would become part of the vast intelligence that lurked behind the shifting trails and rearranging geography. His car was gone. The clearing was gone. He stood on a trail that stretched infinitely in both directions, lined with trees that whispered his name in voices he almost recognized. Somewhere in the distance, his radio crackled with distress calls from other lost souls, people who had entered the forest with their own certainties and measurements, all of them slowly learning that some places existed specifically to prove that certainty itself was an illusion. Daniel began walking. He had no choice but to move forward, deeper into a geography that fed on understanding and grew stronger with each attempt to comprehend it. Behind him, the trail disappeared as he passed, and ahead of him, it materialized just quickly enough to give him somewhere to place his next step. The forest had found another analyst to absorb, another mind convinced it could solve any puzzle. It would keep him walking until he learned what Sarah had learned, that some mysteries were never meant to be solved, only experienced, and that the price of experience in this place was everything he'd once believed about the nature of reality itself. Christopher's hands trembled as he pressed the phone against his ear, watching the forest ranger's lips move without really hearing the words. Something about search parameters, about how kids sometimes wandered off, about staying positive. The words felt distant, hollow, like they were coming from underwater. Emily had been missing for 18 hours now. "Mr. Davies?" The ranger's voice cut through the fog in his mind. "I asked if you're ready to head out." Christopher nodded, shouldering his pack. The weight of it felt wrong somehow, heavier on one side than the other, though he'd packed it himself just minutes ago. "Yes, let's go." The trail into Blackwood National Forest stretched ahead like an open wound in the earth. Christopher had hiked these paths with Emily dozens of times, but now they seemed different somehow. Narrower. The trees pressed closer, their branches reaching across the trail like gnarled fingers trying to grab something just out of reach. "She's probably just lost," he told himself, though the thought felt strange in his head, like someone else had put it there. Kids get turned around all the time, but Emily wasn't just any kid. She was careful, smart, knew these woods almost as well as he did. She wouldn't just wander off from their campsite in the middle of the night, unless... Christopher stopped walking. The ranger continued ahead for several steps before noticing. "Something wrong? Did you hear that?" Christopher tilted his head, listening. There had been something, a sound like whispering just below the threshold of hearing. The ranger frowned. "Hear what?" The forest was silent except for the distant call of a jay and the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Christopher shook his head. "Nothing. I thought..." Never mind. They walked deeper into the wilderness, the trail winding through stands of towering Douglas firs and across streams that gurgled with snowmelt. Christopher tried to focus on the search, on finding Emily, but his thoughts kept drifting. Strange thoughts. Violent thoughts that made him uncomfortable. What if she's already dead? The thought hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled, catching himself against a tree trunk. "You okay?" The ranger was beside him now, concern creasing his weathered features. "Fine," Christopher managed. "Just worried." But that hadn't been his thought. He was sure of it. The voice in his head had been different somehow. Colder, more clinical. Like someone examining a specimen. They found Emily's backpack 2 hours later, hanging from a branch 15 feet off the ground. There was no way she could have reached that high. No way the pack could have gotten there naturally. The ranger stood beneath it, scratching his beard and looking troubled. "That's unusual," he admitted. Christopher stared up at the bright blue backpack, his daughter's name written in black marker across the front pocket. Something cold moved in his stomach. How did it get up there? Could be an animal. Bears sometimes. Bears don't hang backpacks on branches. The words came out harsher than Christopher intended. He could feel anger building in his chest, hot and acidic. Something put it there. Something wanted us to find it. "Something wanted you to see," whispered that strange voice in his head. "You're next." Christopher pressed his palms against his temples. The headache had started an hour ago, a dull throbbing behind his eyes that was getting progressively worse. "Let's get it down," the ranger said, pulling rope from his pack. "Maybe there's something inside that can help." But when they opened Emily's backpack, Christopher's blood turned to ice. Inside was a child's drawing, but not one Emily had made. The crayon marks were crude, violent, stick figures with red scribbles for blood, trees with faces twisted in agony, and in the center, a dark shape with too many eyes watching everything. At the bottom of the page, in Emily's careful handwriting, were 3 words. "Daddy is next." She didn't write this. Christopher's voice sounded hollow in his own ears. "Emily doesn't draw things like this. She draws horses and rainbows and kids sometimes react to stress in unexpected ways," the ranger said gently. "Being lost in the woods, scared, alone, it can affect their behavior." But she wasn't alone, that cold voice whispered in Christopher's mind. Something was with her. Something that's been watching your family for a very long time. Christopher closed his eyes, trying to shut out the voice, but it only seemed to get louder. "It knows where you live. It knows about Sarah waiting at home. It knows about the spare key under the flower pot and the way Emily always forgets to lock her bedroom window." "We need to keep moving," Christopher said abruptly, stuffing the drawing into his jacket pocket. "She's still out there." They pushed deeper into the forest as the afternoon wore on. The trail became less distinct, branching off in directions that didn't match Christopher's memory of the area. Trees seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. The sun, which should have been setting in the west, appeared to be moving in the wrong direction entirely. "Are we lost?" Christopher asked. The ranger consulted his GPS unit, frowning. "That's strange. This thing says we're about 5 miles north of where we should be, but we've been following the main trail the whole time." "Technology lies," the voice in Christopher's head observed with amusement. "But I don't." Christopher's hands were shaking now. The headache had spread from behind his eyes to encompass his entire skull, a crushing pressure that made it hard to think clearly. When he looked at the ranger, the man's face seemed to flicker sometimes, as if there were something else underneath trying to get out. "I need to rest," Christopher said, leaning against a tree. The bark felt wet under his palm, though it hadn't rained in days. "Of course." The ranger set down his pack and pulled out a water bottle. "Here, drink something. Dehydration can cause hallucinations." Christopher took the bottle, but when he raised it to his lips, the water tasted wrong, metallic, like blood. She screamed when it took her, the voice whispered. "Did you know that? She called for you, Daddy, over and over. But you weren't there." "Stop," Christopher said aloud. "Stop what?" The ranger was looking at him with growing concern. "Nothing. Christopher rubbed his forehead. "I keep hearing things, thinking things that aren't mine." The ranger's expression changed subtly. A flicker of something that might have been fear crossed his features before he quickly suppressed it. "What kind of things?" "Tell him about the dreams," the voice urged. Tell him about the ones where you hurt Sarah, where you hurt Emily before she disappeared. Tell him how good it felt. Christopher's stomach lurched. He had been having dreams like that, vivid nightmares that left him sick and shaking. But they were just dreams. They had to be. I think something's wrong with me, he whispered. Nothing's wrong. I'm just helping you see clearly. Emily didn't disappear, Christopher. You made her disappear, don't you remember? Images flashed through his mind. Emily crying, Emily running, Emily begging him to stop. But those weren't real memories. They couldn't be. He loved his daughter. He would never hurt her. Look in your pocket, the voice suggested, the one with the drawing. With trembling fingers, Christopher reached into his jacket. The drawing was still there, but now there was something else. Something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A lock of Emily's hair tied with her favorite ribbon, the one she'd been wearing when she disappeared. Where did this come from? He asked the ranger, holding up the hair. But when he looked up, the ranger was gone. Christopher spun around, searching the clearing, but he was completely alone. There were no footprints in the dirt beside his own, no sign that anyone else had ever been there at all. There was never a ranger, the voice said, and Christopher could hear the smile in it. Just you, wandering in circles, talking to yourself, slowly going insane. No. Christopher backed away from nothing, stumbling over roots and rocks. No, he was real. I talked to him. He helped me get the backpack down. You got the backpack down yourself. You hung it there in the first place after you killed her. I didn't kill her, Christopher screamed at the empty forest. I love my daughter. Then why is her blood under your fingernails? Christopher looked down at his hands. His fingernails were indeed dirty, stained with something dark that he hadn't noticed before. He scraped at it frantically, but it wouldn't come off. She fought so hard, the voice continued, almost dreamily, scratched and bit and struggled. But you were stronger. You're always stronger than they think. Christopher ran. He crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes and face, the voice in his head growing louder with every step. The forest around him began to change, trees twisting into impossible shapes, the sky darkening to a sickly green color that belonged to no earthly sunset. You can't run from yourself, the voice laughed. Where are you going to go? Home to Sarah? She knows what you did. Why do you think she hasn't called? Why do you think she isn't out here looking too? Christopher stopped running. He pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands, scrolling to Sarah's number. The phone showed dozens of missed calls from her, starting from yesterday morning and continuing through the night. But he didn't remember hearing the phone ring. He didn't remember seeing these calls before. He hit redial. Christopher? Sarah's voice was thick with tears. Oh God, where are you? The police came by this morning. They found Emily's clothes by the river. They're covered in blood. What? Christopher's voice cracked. What are you talking about? Emily's missing. I'm out here looking for her. There was a long silence on the other end. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Christopher, Emily's been dead for 3 days. You brought her body home yourself. Don't you remember? The phone slipped from Christopher's numb fingers, clattering on the ground. Around him, the forest was changing again, the trees melting like wax, revealing the familiar walls of his own basement. Emily's body lay on the concrete floor, small and still and so very cold. Now you remember? The voice said, and Christopher realized it wasn't coming from inside his head anymore. It was coming from Emily. Her dead eyes were open, staring at him with an intelligence that had nothing to do with his daughter. I've been trying to tell you for days, but you kept forgetting, kept making up stories about search parties and missing children. The human mind is so fragile, so eager to protect itself from unbearable truths. Christopher fell to his knees beside his daughter's body. Blood covered his hands, his clothes, the floor. How had he forgotten? How had he convinced himself she was missing when her corpse was right here? You didn't kill her, the thing wearing Emily's face said, sitting up with unnatural smoothness. But you're going to. Tomorrow night. Just like you're going to kill Sarah the night after that. And then yourself, when there's no one left. I won't, Christopher whispered. I'll fight you. You already tried. This is the 4th time we've had this conversation. Each time, you forget. Each time you remember. Each time you break a little more. Emily's corpse stood up, moving with joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. When she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too many. Tomorrow you'll wake up believing she's missing again. You'll call the police, organize search parties, wander the woods talking to people who aren't there. And tomorrow night, when you remember the truth, you'll be a little more ready to accept what comes next. Christopher tried to scream, but no sound came out. The basement walls were dissolving again, revealing the forest, revealing the empty clearing where he stood alone with blood under his fingernails and his daughter's hair in his pocket. See you tomorrow, Daddy, Emily's voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. We have so much more to do together. The forest returned to normal. Birds sang in the distance. The sun was setting in the west, just like it should. Christopher's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Any luck finding Emily? I'm getting worried. He stared at the message, confusion flooding through him. Find Emily? But Emily was... Christopher couldn't remember what Emily was, only that she was missing, and he needed to find her before something terrible happened. He started walking deeper into the woods, calling her name. Behind him, something that might have been laughter echoed through the trees. Tyler Hoffman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and stepped out of his rental SUV, the crisp mountain air hitting his face like a slap of reality. The parking lot of Blackwood National Park stretched empty before him, save for a single rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. He'd driven 8 hours from Denver to investigate what the local sheriff's department had dismissed as another hiker vanished into thin air case. But Tyler knew better. There was always a logical explanation. Connor Mills, 26, experienced outdoorsman, had disappeared 3 weeks ago during what should have been a routine solo camping trip. The kind of case that made locals whisper about ancient curses and forest spirits, but Tyler specialized in debunking exactly that sort of nonsense. Armed with his PhD in behavioral psychology and 15 years of consulting for law enforcement, he'd built a career on exposing the rational truth behind supposedly supernatural disappearances. The trail Connor had taken snaked upward through dense pine forest, marked by occasional orange blazes that seemed to fade the deeper Tyler ventured. His GPS unit beeped reassuringly every few minutes, a digital anchor to civilization. The logical mind required logical tools. After 2 hours of steady climbing, Tyler reached Connor's intended campsite. The area showed clear signs of recent habitation, a flattened circle where a tent had stood, the black remains of a campfire, even a few scattered energy bar wrappers. But something felt wrong. The silence pressed against his eardrums with unnatural weight. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Tyler pulled out his digital camera and began documenting the scene with methodical precision. Evidence, facts, data, these would tell Connor's story far better than the hysterical accounts from locals about things that shouldn't be wandering these woods. You're being watched. The thought materialized in his mind so suddenly and completely that Tyler actually looked around, searching for its source. Just his subconscious picking up environmental cues, he told himself. The isolation, the strange silence. Perfectly natural psychological responses to unfamiliar surroundings. But as he continued photographing, that feeling of observation intensified. The sensation crawled along his spine like cold fingers, and Tyler found himself glancing over his shoulder more frequently. When he knelt to examine what looked like drag marks leading away from the campsite, the feeling became overwhelming. Something is coming. Something hungry. Tyler shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. These weren't his thoughts. The voice in his head carried a tone of desperate warning that felt alien, foreign. He pressed his palms against his temples, applying pressure as if he could squeeze out the intrusion. Auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and altitude, he muttered aloud, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Perfectly explainable phenomenon. But even as he spoke, he found himself following the drag marks deeper into the forest. Each step felt both compelled and reluctant, as if some part of him wanted to turn back while another part pulled him forward with invisible strings. The trail led to a grove where the trees grew in an almost perfect circle. In the center, Tyler discovered something that made his rational mind stutter. Dozens of personal items arranged in neat rows. Watches, rings, hiking boots, cameras, all showing various stages of weather damage, some clearly decades old. Run. Run now, before it notices you're here. The voice in his head was clearer now, more insistent. Tyler fumbled for his cell phone, desperate to call for backup, but the screen showed no signal. Of course, he was miles from the nearest tower. He began photographing the bizarre collection, his academic mind already formulating theories. Some kind of animal cache behavior, perhaps. Crows were known to collect shiny objects. But as his camera's flash illuminated the items, Tyler noticed something that made his blood turn to ice water. One of the hiking boots bore Connor's name written in fading black marker. It's in your head now. Can you feel it moving around? Touching things? Soon you won't know which thoughts are yours. Tyler dropped his camera, the device clattering onto the forest floor. The voice wasn't his imagination anymore. It was Connor's voice speaking directly into his mind with crystal clarity. Connor? Tyler whispered into the empty grove. Connor, where are you? Gone, fed to something that lives in thoughts and dreams. But it's still hungry, still looking for fresh minds to corrupt. The rational part of Tyler's brain screamed that this was impossible. A stress-induced psychotic break brought on by isolation and the disturbing crime scene. But Connor's voice continued its urgent whisper inside his skull. And with each word, Tyler felt something else stirring in the dark corners of his consciousness. Something that definitely wasn't him. You have to fight it. Don't let it make you forget who you are. I tried to fight, but I wasn't strong enough. It fed on my memories until there wasn't enough left of me to resist. Tyler's hands shook as he retrieved his camera. The logical thing was to leave immediately, call for a full search and rescue team, approach this with proper backup and equipment. But his legs refused to move. Something was wrapping itself around his motor functions like invisible wire. Tyler, can you hear me? My voice is getting fainter. It's eating the memory of who I was. Soon there won't be enough left to warn you. This isn't real, Tyler said aloud, his voice cracking. Psychological manifestation of guilt and stress. The mind creates explanations for the unexplainable. But even as he spoke, he felt something else laugh inside his head. Something that definitely wasn't Connor. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. Tyler's breath began to mist and frost started forming on the scattered belongings around him. His rational mind searched frantically for meteorological explanations while something else, something hungry and ancient, began to explore the pathways of his consciousness, like a parasite finding its way through a new host. Too late, Connor's voice whispered, already growing distant. It's inside now. God help you, Tyler. Don't let it make you forget. Connor's voice faded to nothing, leaving Tyler alone with the thing that had consumed his friend's mind. And in the terrible silence that followed, Tyler felt his own thoughts beginning to blur around the edges as something else learned to speak with his voice. Tyler tried to run then, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked animal, but his legs moved in directions he didn't choose. His own body was betraying him, guided by an intelligence that wasn't his. Behind him, he could hear something laughing with Connor's voice, then his own voice, then voices he didn't recognize at all. By the time the search team found Tyler 3 days later, wandering the parking lot in circles and muttering to himself about feeding time, there wasn't enough left of his mind to tell them what had really happened to Connor Mills. The parasite had learned to mimic Tyler's voice perfectly by then. It told the rescuers exactly what they wanted to hear about getting lost and disoriented, about finding no trace of the missing hiker. And when they asked about the dozens of personal belongings he'd somehow collected and arranged in neat rows in his hotel room, Tyler's borrowed voice explained it as a stress response to the unsuccessful search. The thing wearing Tyler's mind smiled with his face and began planning its next meal. After all, the search team would need to return to look for Connor eventually. And there were so many fresh thoughts walking around in those healthy, unsuspecting heads, so many new voices to add to its collection.